Hey everybody, welcome back. So in this lecture, I'm going to cover three different topics. We're looking at generally feminism and utopian literature in all three of the assignments and all three of the lectures. We're going to start with Rakia Sakawat Hussein, Sultana's Dream, and we will look at a utopian woman's space that is a reversal of fortunes. So, what if in a sexist society, men had to reverse the roles and women reverse the roles? What would that look like? It's a very short science fiction film, a book written around, a short story written around early 1900 by Rakia, written in Bengali, India, and she is an Islamic woman. And there's also a video that goes along with this too. So it's very easy to read, and also I think the illustrated, not kind of animated version of it is also really good too. From that, I want to look closer at women's utopias and technocracies in art, literature, and film, and how they operate and don't operate as utopias and dystopias. And then I want to have a short discussion over that. And then the main thing at the end of this is a short lecture on individualism and Sigmund Freud, civilizations and its discontents, interpretations of dreams, and then studying how your responsibilities as an individual versus your responsibilities to society and collectively, how do we weigh them in a dystopian science fiction film put out by PBS, from the book The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin, who we'll also see in our lecture on women's utopias. So starting with our kind of cover for the three lectures here, titled Feminism and Utopian Literature Introduction. So we're going to study cultural theory through feminism, generally defined as advocating for rights and equality for women. Feminism is a cultural theory and practice that transforms the lives of women all over the world. The Feminine Mystique is a book in 1963 by Betty Friedan, which is widely credited with sparking the beginning of the second wave of feminism. The first wave was the suffragette movement and getting women the right to vote. Women today hold the same jobs as men, political office, and are generally thought of as equal. That wasn't true in the beginning of the 20th century when women weren't allowed to vote, and in other parts of the world, treatment of women is still far less than ideal. We will study literature at the turn of the century from an Islamic woman in India, Sakia, who wrote of a all-woman utopia. And then we'll study the phenomenon of utopias as well, as I kind of said earlier. Is there an alternative way for us to exist in society? That is something that comes up a lot in history. Alternative forms of education, alternative forms of factory work in utopian socialism. These things are always, we were kind of promised a utopian vision with the internet. And all you got to do is look at a room full of people stuck in their phones and completely not aware of the people and the world around them, that it has absolutely a dystopian quality to it. And I love this Wonder Woman image here to start this part of our class out. Back. All men are banned from the island by Aphrodite's law. And there's a warning there. Any man attempting to set foot on this island will be killed. And this guy obviously has just kind of washed up and was probably not planning on being there. All right, so let's Let's get into the first part of this. So to help us with what we're reading in Sultanas Dream, let's take a look at the culture that it's coming from and see if that helps us in any way to understand the book even better. Again, because it's a pretty short story, you don't have a lot of explanation, a lot of build up to it. You kind of have to know a little bit where it's coming from. Although I think even if you have very little idea of where it's coming from, the book can still be enjoyable as a work of science fiction and as a work of feminist literature. So India, known as a subcontinent in Asia, it has had the Indus River basin that was cultured and inhabited at least 9,000 years ago, that grew into the Indus Valley civilization. By 400 BC, stratification and exclusion by caste had emerged within the dominant religion of Hinduism, and Buddhism and Jainism had arisen, proclaiming social orders unlinked to heredity. Early political consolidations gave rise to a loose-knit Mauryan and Gupta empires based in the Ganges basin. The collective area is suffused with wide-ranging creativity, but also marked by a declining status of women, and the incorporation of the untouchability of the organized system of belief in the caste system. In the medieval era, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism also are established on India's southern and western coasts. In 1947, the British Empire was partitioned into the British Indian Empire was partitioned into two independent dominions: the Hindu majority dominion of India and the Muslim majority dominion of Pakistan. Amid large-scale loss of life and unprecedented migration, India has been a federal republic since 1950, governed through a democratic parliamentary system and getting rid of the dominance of the government of Great Britain in the process. It's pluralistic, multilingual, multi-ethnic society, and is one of the largest economies in the world, with an expanding middle class. Indian movies, music, and spiritual teachings have been part of the global world for a while. Remember that the Beatles went to India to get some of that spiritual teaching. And of course, Bollywood is always making really fantastic films in a very kind of unique Bollywood kind of way. Although Islam is a minority in India, and again, most of Islam now is partitioned in Pakistan, as Pakistan used to be part of India and now is its own autonomous nation. The Delhi Sultanate, or the Sultanate of Delhi, is a Muslim empire based in Delhi that stretched over parts of the Indian subcontinent over medieval India for 320 years, from about 1200 to 1500, covered large swaths of territory that include India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and some parts of southern Nepal. Again, those other countries have broken away and are now autonomous. In 1526, the Sultanate was conquered and succeeded by the Mughal Empire. The rise of the Delhi Sultanate in India was part of a wider trend affecting much of the Asian continent, including the whole southern and western Asia and the influx of nomadic Turkish people from the Central Asian steppes. A major military contribution of the Delhi Sultanate was the campaigns that repelled the Mongol empires and their invasions of India, and pushes them back into China. Many historians argue that the Delhi Sultanate was responsible for making India more multicultural and cosmopolitan. So Islam is a monotheistic religion articulated by the Quran. Religious concepts and practices include the 5 pillars of Islam, which are the basic concepts and obligatory acts of worship following Islamic law, which touches on virtually every aspect of life and society. They all believe that Muhammad is the prophet who spoke directly to God that gives them the guidance in their religion. They believe that all mankind will be judged on their good and bad deeds and consigned to either paradise or hell. And these 5 pillars are the 5 basic acts of Islam considered obligatory for all believers. The Quran, their holy book, sets them as a framework and a sign of commitment to the faith. So number 1, you have the creed. You believe that Allah is the true God and Muhammad is a prophet. You have daily prayers 5 times a day. You give a percentage of your money to the poor or to the local mosque. You fast during the day from Ramadan, which is a month that floats depending on the year. And then the one that's obligatory, if you can manage to do it, is to take a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, at least once in your lifetime, which is the center point of all Islamic life in Saudi Arabia. So this is a religion that has spread over much of the Asian continent into Indonesia, and also much of northern Africa is also Islamic. Since we're studying an Islamic woman writer, what are the roles of women? What do women do in Islamic culture? So women are guided by the primary Islamic sources of personal law from the Quran and the Hadiths. So the Quran is directly from Muhammad, and the Hadiths have come later in terms of how to behave and what are your obligations by being a Muslim. There are also secondary forms such as fatwas that are written by clerics later in more contemporary terms. The secondary sources vary with various sects of Islam and the schools of law. Islamic laws and cultural customs impact various stages of a Muslim woman's life, including her education, employment opportunities, rights to inheritance, female circumcision, dress, age of marriage, freedom to consent to marry, marriage contract, permissibility of birth control, divorce, sex outside or before marriage, her ability to receive justice in the case of sex crimes, property rights independent of her husband, and when salat or prayers are mandatory for her. Sharia law provides for a complementary role between men and women. Being a Muslim is more than a religious identity. Islam outlines the structures and ways in which women should live their lives and dress on a day-to-day basis. Islam gives women a number of rights which were not enjoyed by Western women until the 19th century. For example, until 1882, the property of women in England was given to their husbands when they were married. But Muslim women always retained their own assets. Muslim women could specify conditions in their marriage contract, such as the right to divorce should their husband take another wife. Also, Muslim women in many countries keep their own last name after marriage. Islam also encouraged religious education of Muslim women. So, Mughal India. The Mughal Empire was an early modern empire that controlled much of South Asia in the 16th and 19th century, said to have been founded in 1526 by Babur, a warrior chieftain from Uzbekistan, who employed aid from the neighboring Safavid and Ottoman empires to defeat the Sultan and the Sultanate of Delhi that we looked at earlier. Through warfare and diplomacy, Akbar, who becomes kind of the greatest of the rulers, of the Mughal rulers, He extends the empire in several directions, controlling almost the entire Indian subcontinent in the north. He created a new ruling elite loyal to him. He implemented modern administration and encouraged cultural developments. Their painting and their architecture, like the Taj Mahal, are some of the finest accomplishments in art and architecture in the history of the world. They developed a strong and stable economy, and that led to commercial expansion and economic development. The imperial structure lasts until 1720, when the empire was dissolved by the British Raj after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Mughal economics and culture. Although the Mughal Empire was created and sustained by military warfare, it did not vigorously suppress the cultures and peoples that it came to rule. Rather, it equalized and placated them through new administrative practices and diverse ruling elites, leading to a more efficient, centralized, and standardized rule. The base of the empire's collective wealth was agricultural taxes introduced by the third Mughal emperor, Akbar. These taxes, which amounted to well over half of the output of the peasant cultivator, were paid in the well-regulated silver currency and caused peasants and artisans to enter larger markets. The relative peace maintained by the empire during the 17th century was also a factor in this economic expansion. Shah Jahan is another great one, a great of the Mughal emperors, who made the Taj Mahal to house the tomb of his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, and it also houses the tomb of him himself. And we have this beautiful raised dome. We have the Persian minarets, which are often the sign of where a mosque is, and this wonderful reflecting pool that when you stand across from it kind of makes the whole Taj kind of feel like it's floating and not very heavy. Colonization in India. So the British Raj is the rule of the British Crown on the Indian subcontinent until 1947. The region is under British control, was collectively called British India, and of course is run by the British East India Company. So there's kind of a colonization and corporate rule here. And I think generally we believe that corporations are not the best, most humane way to run a country. And that is, of course, also the case here as well. So eventually, the company is going to, through various revolutions, transfer the crown to Queen Victoria, which means that the company does not have to pay to keep its colony's power. The Queen in Great Britain is going to have to pay and bring the soldiers in, and those incur those costs. This will give rise to the princely states of British India. So rather than being controlled really efficiently by one central government, we have the British Crown ruling areas, and then other areas are really ruled by local princes. And so that is really subdividing the way that India can operate in terms of utilizing its vastness and its large population together. Muslim women in India. So the image of Muslim women in India has been shaped by colonial reforms and modern identity formations. Not that women enjoyed a better image in pre-colonial times, but there's a marked shift in how colonial rule and reform use femininity. In early Islam, women enjoyed some mobility given the Quranic injunctions elevating their position in traditional Arab society of Mecca and Medina. Some even became leaders in politics and reformers in their own right, like the central Indian state of Bhopal Begums, who in the 19th century were also ardent supporters of female education. However, women battled male chauvinism, be it Muslim or Hindu, rationalized by theological discourses, discriminating space into controlled public spaces that were male and unregulated private spaces that were female. So women were basically bound to stay indoors and out of public space. That limits what women can do in business, that limits what women can do educationally, and also really limits the quality of life. This is even more the case in the colonial rule. The impressions of male chauvinism formed part of an overall pattern of cultural criticism of India designed both to justify the British assumption of imperial control and also to convert India to their, quote, civilizing mission. Eventually, Muslim women were confined to the private sphere, symbolizing their inner spiritual life, equating gender with the domestic. So dear to the Victorian patriarchs, right? That is exactly what women are supposed to be, mothers and staying in the home. This private yet colonialized space was the home was to be colonialized and made public by first by colonial rule. And that is where we come to our author, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain. So, born in 1880, she is living in the peak of British colonialization in India. She lives a short but meaningful life as a writer and activist. She is married off in an arranged marriage to an older man. That older man is going to encourage her education. In fact, she believes the lack of education is the responsibility for women lagging behind men in society that we see in her writing. She has represented the face of Muslim feminism in Bengal, and she pushed for an equal society through her writing and her activism, and she founded a girls' school, the Islamic Women's Association. So she is actively trying to get women out of the home and educated, and again, trying to get back to the public sphere where women should be. Some of her major literary works attack the extreme forms of veils and purdah, the practice amongst women in certain Muslim and Hindu societies of living in a separate room or behind a curtain, or of dressing in all-enveloping clothes in order to stay out of the sight of men or strangers. She claims this is bad for women and stops them from thinking and working independently. That's something we find in American feminism as well, that when women were subjugated to the home and as mothers and didn't realize because they were at home all the time that other women were suffering the way that they were, in the 60s, women had, and 70s, women had consciousness-raising sessions where they got together and found out that they were all suffering in the same way. So, Ruqayya also wrote a science fiction novella called Sultanas Dream, in which she lives in a feminist utopia ruled by women. Okay, what are these utopias then? So utopia generally describes an imaginary community or society that possesses highly desirable or nearly perfect qualities for all its members. And normally what we find out is that for some members it's great, and other members it's a total dystopia. Hypothetical utopias focus on equality, categories like economics, government, justice, with the method and structure of proposed implementation varying in different degrees based on ideology. There are socialist, capitalist, monarchical, democrat, many ways of thinking about utopias. The opposite of a utopia is a dystopia. Utopia and dystopian fiction is very popular in fiction, especially in science fiction, which we'll be looking at later. The first time we see utopia in literature is in Thomas More And his book, Utopia, that he publishes in 1516, this is a fictional island that was a peninsula that was turned into a utopia founded by King Utopos. And the island contained 54 cities, each city divided into 4 equal parts ruled by a prince. There's no private property on Utopia, with goods being shared in warehouses and people requesting what they need. There are no locks on the doors of the houses, and the houses rotate between citizens every 10 years. Agriculture provides the most important occupation on the island, and every person is taught it and must live in the countryside farming for 2 years at a time, with women doing the same work as men. Every citizen must also learn another essential trade: weaving, done mainly by women, carpentry, metalsmithing, and masonry. Unemployment is eradicated. Slavery is a feature of utopian life, which again sounds strange that you would have a utopia but also have slaves, and it's reported every household has 2 slaves. The slaves either come from other countries, from prisoners of war, people condemned to die, or poor people. What a shitty utopia this is turning out to be. Gold is part of the community wealth of the country, and fettering criminals with it or using it for shameful things like chamber pots gives citizens a healthy dislike of it. It also makes it difficult to steal, as it is in plain view. So we have a welfare state, free hospitals, euthanasia permitted by the state, priests are allowed to marry, divorce is permitted, premarital sex is punished by a lifetime of enforced celibacy, and adultery is punished by enslavement. Again, what a shitty utopia this is, outside of some of the other stuff that kind of are cool. Meals are taken in community dining halls. The job of feeding the population is given to a different household, and there are no lawyers, and the law is made deliberately simple so everybody understands that there is no doubt in right or wrong. And God help you if you do wrong or have premarital sex. There are several religions in the islands: moon worshippers, sun worshippers, planet worshippers, ancestor worshippers, monotheists, and everyone is tolerant. The only people who are despised are atheists, even though they are allowed. But they are seen as representing a danger to the state, since they do not believe in any punishment or reward after this life and have no reason to share the communistic life of utopia, and will break laws for their own gain. So here again is an idea that you can belong to any religion you want as long as you belong to a religion. Atheists still today are kind of looked down upon in our society, aren't they? Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to read Sultanas Dream. There's a PDF here on the slide. But there is also about a 10-minute video that is the entire transcription of the book with these really wonderful illustrations in them. So I think since it's transcribed word for word, whether you watch the video or whether you read it, depending on how you like to take your media in, I think it really doesn't matter, because every word will be the same in either media. She writes this in 1905. Rokia does, when she's 25 to 28. And it is published in a proto-science fiction, as a proto-science fiction story in the Indian's Lady magazine, a Madras-based English language periodical edited by and for women. In this story, the narrator practices purdah, where women are sequestered in the home in the Zanana area, kind of the center of the house. Whisked away to a future city-state known as Ladyland, Sultana is first hesitant to venture out into the street. Isn't it unsafe for women to be out there? Her host, however, reassures her she has nothing to fear because 30 years earlier, in a war that killed off a lot of the nation's menfolk, the surviving men were ordered to isolate themselves indoors, where they have remained ever since, and they have become fearful and passive themselves. So notice that this is a reversal. What if we reversed the fortunes? What would that look like? And in this ladyland, we have 2-hour workdays, solar technology, flower-paved streets, and it's possible, made possible by female scientists and leaders. The religion is one of love and truth. And one of the things that I have found interesting in sharing this with students, in particular a high school that I taught this college course at, I think that the young women in my class were really fascinated with this idea of being able to walk the streets without having to look out for yourself because you might be a target for some man for some reason. And men don't go through that same fear, I don't think, in the same kind of way. Yes, depending on whether or not you appear to be a target, possibly as queer or trans, definitely you're always looking around as being a possible target. And certainly men are certainly going through that. However, this fictional place where women can exist without that fear is a really interesting intellectual space that my students were kind of blown away that that was ever a type of possibility that could exist. And I think that that's one of the fascinating things about reading this, is allowing yourself to imagine what would this world look like. I end the lecture talking about various religions in India, so we just kind of understand that Muslims are now, not when the book was written, Sultanas Dream, but now we are looking at, because of the partition, a real dominance of Hindu culture and less Muslims than ever, a couple of Christians, some Sikhs. I think the Sikhs are pretty interesting. They generally have names like Singh for lion if they're male, Kaur for princess is their last name, and these names were given by the gurus to allow the Sikhs to stand out and also to act as a defiance to the caste system. And this caste system, you are born into a caste, whether it's a warrior caste or an intellectual caste, or a laborer caste, or an untouchables class, and you are not able through education or economics to break out of that caste. In other words, you are stuck where you were born. And the Sikhs are generally flying the middle finger at this idea. And they are also seen as the front line to provide humanitarian aid across the world as all. So we should all love the Sikhs, right? Jainism is a form, an offshoot of Buddhism, which also originates in India, even though mostly it exists in Southeast and the Far East, Asia, China, and Japan in particular. Number of their religious beliefs that they share. They live under the same constitution today. But otherwise, they really don't see a lot of commonality between Hindus and Muslims. There is a large range of religious groups, and they say that it's important to stop people in their community from marrying into other religious groups. Moreover, Indians generally stick to their own religious group. I imagine that is part of also sticking to your same caste as well. Hindus overwhelmingly say, most of all of their close friends are Hindu. So we are looking at a large country where you are staying in your own lane, as it were. I have a slide on the holiness of the Ganges according to Hinduism. I talk about Dharma and Karma. Dharma is living the right way, your actions that based on your caste and the outcome of what your future is going to be, your actions are important. That is your duty in life. And karma refers to the actions that you do in relationship to the Dharma. That is kind of a cosmic tally. And ideally, if you do more good actions, good luck will come to you, and in your rebirth and your cycle of rebirth, your good actions will outweigh your bad actions, and you will move to a higher caste or the lower caste if you, or a lower form if you do bad. In terms of Indian spirituality, the Brahman and the Atman are pretty fascinating. The Atman translates into English as the eternal self, the spirit, the essence, the soul, the breath. And the Atman is a part of the larger Brahman, the unchanging universal spirit or consciousness which underlies all things. Brahman is similar in many ways to the Western concept of God, infinite, eternal, unchanging. And ideally in Hindu technology, or in Hindu theology, your Atman is reincarnated over and over again in different bodies. And the cycle ends when finally your Atman is reconnected with the God, the overall creativity, and the Brahman, and you become one with creationism again. I have a couple slides on Hinduism, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva in Hinduism. I have a slide on Buddhism. I talk about the Dharmapada. And again, just kind of give you a chance to, if you're interested in the different religions besides Islam, that is really what's important for our assignment to start with. I just gave you some extra information there. All right. So for our Sultanas Dream assignment, I want you to tell me what a utopia is. I want you to write a thorough summary of the story, talk about the way that the utopia looks and works. I want you then to consider, why are women better suited to lead according to this story? And I want you to talk about the instances that are cited. And again, do you perceive those instances in working generally, and could they work outside of this country as well? And then what do you think about this particular utopia? The next part of our lecture, Women's Utopias, Technocracy, and Art in Literature and in Media. So we are going to watch a film based on a book by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of her great utopian writings is the Dispossessed, a 1974 anarchist utopian science fiction novel. And it is exploring themes such as anarchy and revolutionary societies, capitalism's utopia, individualism, and collectivism. It features the development of the mathematical theory underlying a fictionable Ansible, a device capable of faster-than-light communications, sending messages without delay between star systems and everywhere else. It is set on two fictional worlds, the Anaras and the Uras, twin inhabited worlds. The Uras is divided into several states, but is dominated by two rival superpowers, Alo and Tu. While on Urus, the main character spends most of his time in Alo, a state with a capitalist economy and a patriarchal system. The state of Tu is never actually visited, but is said to have an authoritarian system that claims to rule in the name of the proletariat. Sounds a lot like a Russian communist state versus Western capital, doesn't it? Alo has dissidents on its borders, including oppositional left-wing parties, one of which is linked to the rival society of two. So again, that fear of communism leading to new ideas that could possibly disrupt capitalism. On the moon, Anares represents a idealistic ideological structure, anarcho-syndicalism. So there is an ambiguity in terms of the economic and political system of Anares. People consider themselves being free and independent, having broken from the political and social influence of the old world. Again, very similar to the break of from Marxism into other states, also from the interest of socialism and things like this. And in this book, mainly the conflicts that are occurring are between anarchist principles and the constraints imposed by authority and society. There are no written laws on Anares. However, in practice, there are strong conventions about how things should be done. So the Dispossessed is depicting an anarchist syndicist alternative to capitalism. And that's something that in the capitalist world, we are constantly led to believe by capitalist forces that there is no good alternative. Look at what happened in Russia. Look at what happened in North Korea. Look at what happens in Vietnam to these communist states, which of course I think are basically dictatorships running under a guise of communism or Marxism, but really are not maybe potentially what an alternative or a socialist state really could be. Capitalism is so afraid of these things, they make us believe there are no alternatives. And I think that's the real benefit of this kind of literature. Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a society composed entirely of women who bear children without men. They have an ideal social order free of war, conflict, and domination. And of course, for this story to have any intrigue and conflict in it, that rising conflict and catharsis that we studied with Aristotle's Poetics, of course, we need men to enter the game here so we can really get a window into this world and find out, find some sort of conflict. So the men come into this world. The women are much stronger than the men, much more capable than the men. The men are imprisoned. Although they are not imprisoned behind bars, they are finding out that they are not really welcome. They ultimately break out of the fortress and they escape to their biplane. Finding the biplane sewn inside a large fabric covering, they're unable to get away, recaptured again. They're treated fairly well, but they are definitely second-class citizens. Again, that idea of the reversal. Eventually, we are going to see the men be wanting to get involved with the women. The women do not have the typical feminine characteristics from our world in terms of hairstyle and curviness. They have no experience or cultural memory of romantic love or sexual intercourse and are not particularly interested in it. And then these marriages that the men are going to have with a woman, they are going to find themselves either unsatisfied or totally satisfied by it, and then eventually will escape and get back to their own world, bringing one of the women with them who is going to find that she had a pretty good thing in her land. So the central theme in her land is defining gender, the roles, how it's socially constructed, and how it's unchangeable and viewed unchangeable by both genders. And we begin to see how those cracks in that unchanging gender role really can happen. One of the interesting things in her land is motherhood. how women, again, do not need men. They are capable of being impregnated by science. They give up their children after a couple of years to be educated by the entire society. They explain that the children are taken care of as a responsibility of the whole community and not just the biological mother. And this leads the girls to grow up aware of the total community rather than breaking off into family factions with perhaps more selfish or limited goals that they have. The book is also focusing on individuality and the ways that the child is given their own unique first name, no last names. They have detailed histories of their lineage, but see no need to claim ownership over their children by instilling their own name on the child the way that men used to do. Education is the highest art, and it is based on Maria's Montessori's principles of education that is not forced-fed as it is in the men's world, but a theme of education in Montessori's, in letting the child decide what they're interested in and how they want to be educated, rather than imposing a strict, maybe static education. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. Now, an art project that was a very important kind of feminist utopia, briefly as an art project in its own way, was Woman House. This is an art installation. I have the entire documentary linked for you here. It was organized by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, who were co-founders of the feminist program at Cal Arts, one of the first feminist art programs in the country. They take over a house in Los Angeles. They have consciousness raising, and there are performances and installations, and together students and professors build an environment where women's conventional social roles could be shown, exaggerated, and ultimately subverted. Highly recommend taking a look at some of this. One of my professors in college, Faith Wilding, she does a performance called Waiting in this that I think is an extraordinary extension of Samuel Beckett and the idea of waiting as an action rather than an inaction. Technological utopianism. So as we shift from feminist utopia to technological utopia, the idea that we can have better overall government through tech is something that I think we still engage in, and something I think that was promised to us with the internet, which in many ways to me is also a dystopia. As I am sitting here recording a lecture rather than doing it live for you, we have decided that we would prefer our reality and our education to be based on an impersonal screen, rather than all of us sitting in the same room and seeing each other's eyes, feeling the heat of the person next to us, and then also the ability of you to interject at any time and for us to talk with each other rather than just this monolithic lecture that I've been doing in all these videos. So, a technocracy is a form of government where the decision maker or makers are based on their expertise in a given area of responsibility in regard to scientific or technical knowledge. And again, I think that is certainly something that we're seeing in, as I said, in the tech that we're wearing, in the desire to have virtual reality rather than real reality. And all of this reminds of what we studied earlier in terms of Baudelaire's hyper-reality. We no longer live a real life. We live a life dominated by technology. Now, there is some great examples of film that show us the utopian and dystopian aspects of living in a technocracy. One of them is a 1971 film. I have the entire film here if you want to watch it. from 1971 by George Lucas, who later will do Star Wars. It is set in a dystopian future where the populace is controlled through android police, mandatory use of drugs that suppress emotions. We have gotten rid of sexual intercourse. Reproduction is prohibited. Mind-altering drugs is mandatory to enforce compliance amongst the citizens. And we are living in this underground labyrinth of tunnels and white spaces. Workers are clad in identical white uniforms, shaven head emphasizing cleanliness and uniformity. Police androids are wearing black, and monks who are robed. There is a religion that you can visit that is a computer talking to you with an image on top of it. And we see in this movie the characters who are named and numbered, like THX 1138, and he is losing his ability to have his grip in this world. The person that he's living with changes his drug dosage, and he becomes kind of aware of what is going on. He ultimately has sex with his partner. They will eventually be incarcerated, and at the end of the film, THX is fleeing the city, ultimately escaping by climbing a ladder, going through a hatch, and we see the polluted world and the setting pink sun of a polluted world that clearly was the reason that we are living in these tunnels. Great, great film. Another recent film that I think shows us the idea of a dystopic technical future is Her, where in Her, a lonely, introverted, depressed man becomes engaged with the voice in his, engaged not in terms of marriage, but engaged in terms of Samantha becomes his best friend, the name of the voice in his computer, and they grow together psychologically, and they become attached, and of course, the people around him are kind of horrified that he has fallen in love with a computer voice, an algorithm, rather than a real human being. Logan's Run is a 1976 American science fiction action film. It is a utopian future society where everybody is young and beautiful and wealth and technology and abundance. Everything is available for them until you turn 30 years old. At age 30, you must undergo the rite of carousel, where you are killed under the idea of being renewed. In a way, I guess, implying that you would go back to your youthful state and live it again. Now, this is interesting because there is a African myth. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but in this myth, you have a man and a woman, and they are approached by God that you can live forever, and every time that you get older, you will be regenerated and you will be young again, or you can have children. And when you have children, you will die. And so the man and the woman ultimately decide to choose children because they're lonely and they really need some help with the farm work, and they decide that, yeah, living forever and being youthful forever is great, but ultimately children would be more satisfying as a life. And I think that's a pretty similar idea to what we're seeing here in terms of youthful. What would happen if that African couple had chosen the opposite rather than having children, and again had this life of this assured life of youthful reincarnation, which of course is ultimately a lie, and we are going to spend much of this film running from that. Now, the Lathe of Heaven, a film that we are going to watch. This is an adaptation in 1980 from PBS. It's the most money they ever spent on a film. The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. We are going to follow a character named George Orr, who is misusing medication because he is trying not to dream, because his dreams alter reality. And he is sentenced by the state to be reformed through psychiatry. And his psychiatrist, Dr. Haber, is going to find out this amazing skill that he has, and he is going to use it to try to change the world for good. And what the film and Ursula K. Le Guin is trying to tell me is that often these do-gooders, they try to do something to change overpopulation, world hunger, yada, yada, yada. And ultimately, these things are much more complex and do not have simple answers. And Haber ultimately wrecks the world and himself in the process of trying to control George Orr. I think there are interesting questions in this film about autonomy and also when you have gifts to give to the world, how much of your gifts are you obligated to share with the world, and how much of your gifts are just yours and you have no obligation? I think there's some really interesting questions that arise out of this. And the last slide, perhaps one of the great technocratic dystopian films of all time, is Blade Runner from 1982, a adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick from 1968. The film is set in dystopian Los Angeles in 2019, and a future in which synthetic humans known as replicants are bioengineered by a large corporation to work on off-world colonies. A few of them escape and want to go to the person who created them to find out why have they been created to die. And again, questions that I think we ask in life too. Why? What happens to us when we die? Why must we die? And in this film, there is a sense of foreboding and paranoia, and we see a polluted world that is entirely transformed by flying cars and neon and video screens, and Los Angeles has become a mixture of several different cultures and speaking an entirely unintelligible language as well. Really, really fascinating about dystopia. For this part of our class, I have a couple of questions. If you could make a utopian society, what would it look like, and how would people relate to each other? So really get deep into the weeds on that. And then what factors have you discovered from what we studied and also from any ideas that you have or know? What factors make utopian societies likely to become dystopias? And then also I would like you to meaningfully comment on one of your fellow students. Not just saying you like their ideas, but try to engage their ideas and offer further commentary on things that they have started or alternatives or disputes to ideas. Do not just simply say, oh, I like your idea. That is not what I mean by the comment. Be generous with your intellectual capabilities. And the last part of this lecture, which will lead to the assignment of watching The Lathe of Heaven, which I had just kind of briefly described for you in the last lecture. So we are going to watch The Lathe of Heaven, and what I want us to think about is individualism versus society or versus collectivism, and we will look at that a little bit in Sigmund Freud. So in Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud outlines that civilization's primary conflict is between the will of the individual and the will of the group. The society in which individuals, that the individual lives exist, are constantly compromised by the need for society. So, in other words, for the protection from law and to be in a society, you are giving up some of your individuality. You're giving up some of your ability to do whatever you want and have any whim you want. That is the exchange to live in a society. And Freud argues that in the past, more primitive societies had weaker central governments and had a greater latitude for personal freedoms. Sexual acts or instances of violence tended to be handled within families, which were ruled by very powerful patriarchal father figures. But he complicates this picture by fast-forwarding to Western society over the past few hundred years, and notes that outright critics of civilization claim that society impinges on their individual freedoms, neglects the fact that societies also keep humans safe, and that in itself is a kind of freedom. And we live in this deal brokered between the individual and society. And that is an exchange that is happening between the two. So you're giving up autonomy and gaining protection. The set of arguments is not necessarily psychoanalytic. However, Freud makes the theory by connecting his ideas to the ego and the superego, which he states create the same structure within the individual, and that the ego accepts the internalized government-like monitor in the form of the superego. And that keeps the ego from merely gratifying every wish, desire, and act of aggression or instance of satisfaction that it craves. So this superego, that is law and the understanding of society that is internalized by us. These are parts of his very famous iceberg and three elements of the personality, where you have the superego, law that is controlling how you behave, the ego that is driven by reality, balance of instinctual form of the personality and the moral form of the personality. And what we are trying to stay on top of is this awful id, this animal beast within us that has a hunger for desires and sex and aggression, and then that id has to be under control. You see the id really taken on in an interesting way if you've ever read or seen the 1931 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Hyde, of course, is the beast within when it comes out. I think another interesting way that the beast within comes without is in the 1980s film Teen Wolf, where the teen wolf, as the character becomes the wolf, that id ultimately kind of helps this teenager to become less awkward and accepted by his peers, but he also has to control the bestial instincts at the same time. And then we also, with Freud, have an unconscious that is running our dreams, and a preconscious and a conscious mind where we are aware or we are aware of the awareness. All of this is part of Freud, and we'll study that a little bit later next week when we look at Edward Bernays, a nephew of Freud, who creates American propaganda and also creates a new form of advertising and uses focus groups or psychoanalytic techniques to get people to smoke and to vote for various politicians and stuff. We'll study that coming up. So I have a slide here on individualism and what individualism is. This idea of the intrinsic worth of the individual. I think as Americans, we all crave and love our individuality, that we are allowed to behave and own property and be generally who we want. However, when you begin to really think about the idea of how a civilization and society is controlling our individuality, you begin to question really, well, how free are we as an individual? And those are questions that I ask in terms of looking at what are our responses and what are our freedoms as an individual, and collectively, what are our freedoms and what are responsibilities. And I look at that here in the basis of other societies outside of the United States, in particular Asian countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, and South America, that have a tendency to be more collectivist. And what do we find in collectivist cultures? Individuals define themselves in relationship to others. Communication is more indirect to avoid potential conflict. Group loyalty is encouraged. Decisions are based on what's best for the group. Compromise is favored when a decision needs to be made to achieve a better working level of peace. And rights of families and communities come before those of the individual. One of the last things that I have in this lecture is interpellation by Louis Althusser. This is a process by which ideological systems call out social subjects and tell them their place in the system. In popular culture, it refers to the way that cultural products address their consumers and recruit them into particular ideological positions. And certainly we are seeing that play out today in the public sphere, and in particular the backlash of Bud Light and what has happened to them in terms of their promotion of ideological positions and their product. So Althusser says people are subjects as an effect of ideology. He argues that ideology is a system of representations governed by rules that serve political ends. He uses the term interpellation to describe the process by which an ideology constitutes individual persons as subjects. The ideological, social, and political institutions, family, media, religious organizations, education system, and the discourses they propagate hail the individual in social interactions, giving that person an identity. He compares the ideology to a policeman shouting, "Hey, you," to a person walking in the street. The person responds to the call, and in doing so is transformed into a subject, a self-conscious, responsible agent whose actions can be explained by his or her thoughts. Althusser shows how the situation always precedes the individual or collective subject. So your individuality is not something inherent in you in your tabula rasa. Your sense of individuality comes through the situations that you are put into. That's a certainly interesting idea. Now, also in our film that deals with dreams, I think Freud once again becomes important in terms of his book on the interpretations of dreams. He describes three main types of dreams: direct prophecies received in a dream, the foretelling of a future event in a dream, and also the symbolic dream, which requires interpretation. Dreams, in his view, are forms of wish fulfillment, attempts by the unconscious to resolve a conflict of some sort, whether something recent or something recessed in the past. Because the information in the unconscious is in an unruly and often disturbing form, a censor in the preconscious will not allow it to pass unaltered into the conscious mind. But during dreams, that preconscious is more lax in this duty than in the waking hours, still attentive, but as such, the unconscious must distort and warp the meaning of its information to make it through the censorship. As such, images in dreams are often not what they appear. According to Freud, they need a deeper interpretation if they are to inform us on the structures of the unconscious. And that will take us into our film. Again, this is a film about a dystopian future that is polluted, overpopulated, and a member of this society, a very kind of powerless member, is George Orr, whose dreams alter reality, and Orr is a kind of what we could call a Taoist who believes that it is better for these dreams not to be in action at all. So for Orr, inaction is a form of action here. He's using drugs and is busted for using these drugs in the society, and he must then see a psychoanalysis named William Haber. Haber will ultimately discover Orr's gift or curse, depending on how you want to look at it, maybe a little bit of both, try to use his dreams to change the world with disastrous results. Now, in the assignment, I'd like you to pick a scene from the film, discuss the scene, the setting, the dialogue, the shot selection. Think about everything that we had studied earlier when we studied semiotics, and we studied how semiotics operate in a film. Go back to that, take a look at that, and then kind of use that in your analysis. How does Dr. Haber use George Orr to fix a world problem? How does the film show it fail? And why don't the dreams work out the way Haber wants them to? I think a very good explanation for this is in what we just saw in Freud's interpretations of dreams. The dreams are not coming out of us in any direct way. Therefore, using them to directly fix a problem is in itself problematic, isn't it? Then I'm curious about you. How do your dreams affect you at night? Do you remember any of them? Do your dreams at night ever change you during your waking life? I'm very curious your experiences in those realms. And then the last thing that engages this idea of how are we supposed to act as an individual versus our collective responsibilities, going back to Freud and his ideas on civilizations and the discontent that is natural in civilization. What do we owe the world with our own gifts? And what do we keep for ourselves? We do have some responsibility to others, and then also we do have a responsibility to ourselves as well. Where are you in relationship to all of this? I think this is going to be a really interesting assignment to read your thoughts on all of this. And the movie is really, really good. Made for about $300,000 by PBS. Also, a slide that I forgot to get to in the lecture, there is also an interview with Ursula K. Le Guin about the Lathe of Heaven, where she describes George as a Taoist character. And her thoughts on the film are really good. It's about 25 minutes. I highly recommend that you watch that as a way to understand the film better and therefore do the assignment better as well. I'll talk to you soon, my friends. Take care, and we will meet again.